Chapter 2, Making an Atlantic World. Section 1, Introduction. Between the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal and Spain developed imperial systems based on the islands and coastlines of the Atlantic Ocean. These systems were rooted in the commercial, cultural, legal, and military traditions of the Mediterranean world, but over time, they gave rise to entirely new societies that connected North and South America with Africa, Europe, and Asia. Beginning with the conquest and colonization of the Canary Islands, the Spanish Atlantic extended westward to the Caribbean, and from there to the mainland. Having usurped the great empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes, Spanish claims to the Philippines, in the heart of the Pacific world, meant that a truly global empire had been established. Meanwhile, having occupied the uninhabited islands off its coast during the 1400s, Portugal focused its efforts in the South Atlantic, especially the territories that became Brazil and Angola, as well as bases throughout the Indian Ocean. Each of these systems expanded gradually, often with substantial lulls between periods of frenzied activity, in ways that created increasingly interdependent commercial zones. One of the enduring consequences of this interdependence was the spread of plants, animals, and microorganisms from one continent to another. As Old World biota spread throughout the Atlantic basin, the massive transfer of human populations, along with their cultures, languages, and religions, followed. The result was a new world for all, as one historian has put it. But cultural creativity was the product of survivalism amid pain, loss, and rupture. Point 1. Yet, in the year 1400, few could have predicted that the struggling kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, today's Spain and Portugal, would emerge as global powers over the next 2 centuries. Indeed, explaining late medieval Europe's economic and territorial expansion and the development of capitalism more broadly have been some of the most challenging questions addressed by modern historians. This chapter qualifies Europe's post-1400 expansion by framing the varying motives, strategies, and consequences of colonialism, as well as the limits of imperial control. Of special interest are the economic, political, and social arrangements, all of them predicated on hierarchies of one kind or another, that the Iberians used to manage their overseas empires. Section TW. Europe enters the Atlantic. The intensity of contact between two old worlds intensified after 1492, but trade and technology had been making the globe a more connected place for centuries. Between 800 and 1400 CE, voyagers from Polynesia discovered and populated the Hawaiian Islands. Sailing across the Pacific Ocean in massive canoes, these well-prepared travelers brought family members, seedlings, animals, and tools. By the time contact between Polynesia and Hawaii ceased around 1400, Inuit peoples had completed their settlement of the Arctic, which had taken them from Siberia to Greenland. These migrations were some of the most epic in human history, yet little is known about them outside of their own cultures. Embarking long before Europeans sought a direct route to the Indies, Arab traders, bringing with them sailing technology, Islam, and a written language, had been active in the Indian Ocean world from the 11th century onward. Between 1405 and 1433, China launched 7 maritime expeditions led by Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who became the Ming dynasty's greatest admiral. Intended to open trade and announce China's power in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Zheng He's fleets included tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers carried on ships that dwarfed those sailing in the Mediterranean. The admiral's 5th and 6th expeditions reached the coast of East Africa, a vibrant commercial region where Swahili city-states met the Islamic world. However, following these voyages, China's leaders turned inward, seeking a continental empire. The people of Western Eurasia, whose territories were shaped by several peninsulas and surrounded by hundreds of islands, also developed a strong maritime tradition. At their peak, Scandinavian seafarers sailed as far east as Constantinople and raided settlements as far south as North Africa. Toward the end of the first millennium, they established colonies in Iceland and southern Greenland, where several thousand Norse lived by raising livestock, fishing, and trading with their kin back in Norway. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson reached Newfoundland in present-day Canada. Unlike Greenland and Iceland, however, the Norse colony of Vinland failed within a decade. Culturally and geographically isolated, the Norse were driven back to the sea by some combination of limited resources, inhospitable weather, food shortages, and Inuit resistance. The Norse ventures were largely unheard of beyond Scandinavia, and over the next few centuries, the North Atlantic was visited only sporadically by Basque, English, and Norman fishers. For the most part, European merchants were drawn toward Asia. They were led eastward by the enterprising traders of the Mediterranean, especially those from Genoa and Venice, who managed outposts at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This gave Italian merchants access to the Black Sea, as well as the Silk Road, a network of routes that connected the Islamic world with China. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, a sequence of Christian holy wars, known as the Crusades, failed to conquer the Holy Land from Muslim forces, but they did spark greater commercial interest in Asia. So it was that the Venetian Marco Polo, alongside his father and uncle, spent 25 years traveling across Central Asia and China. His account of these travels gave European audiences their first introduction to China, sparking further interest. During the 1300s, West-East trade was facilitated by the power of the Mongol Khans, whose empire was built on war but eventually brought political stability, the so-called Pax Mongolica, that long-distance trade depended upon. With demand increasing, Asian goods, principally porcelain, spices, silks, and tea, flooded European markets. This trade created new wealth, represented by the merchant guilds of cities from Seville to Bruges. Since goods and information moved together, the late medieval era was also a time of intellectual ferment. Emerging from the crisis of the 14th century, Europeans rediscovered or adopted Greek, Roman, and Muslim knowledge in what became known as the Renaissance or Rebirth. Universities were founded, and Latin Christendom's first books were printed. Commercial integration was ultimately brought to a halt by the Black Death, an outbreak of bubonic plague, and the expansion of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which captured Constantinople in 1453. Led by the Genoese, Mediterranean merchants sought alternative trade routes. Eventually, they looked outward to the Atlantic. Prompted by the intensifying competition for resources and markets, fractious European polities consolidated under the authority of the most powerful warlords. Looking to the legacy of ancient Rome for inspiration, these rulers styled themselves as dukes, kings, and even emperors. By negotiating compromises with the bishops of Rome and selling offices to the nobility, they managed to centralize authority under a single sovereign. Furthermore, almost constant warfare between rival kingdoms led to deepening ties between monarchs and merchants. Unlike the privileged church and nobility, merchants had ready access to cash and were not exempt from most taxes. Over the course of the early modern period, 1400 to 1800, the centralization of military and taxation powers created Europe's nation-states and the conditions for further expansion. In what became Spain, the 1469 marriage of Fernando of Aragon and Isabel of Castile joined two of the most powerful kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. In this region, the Crusades were just winding down. With the surrender of Granada, Europe's last independent Muslim city-state, the combined forces of Castile, Aragon, Portugal, and their allies concluded 8 centuries of intermittent warfare. Mythologized as the Reconquista, reconquest, this protracted conflict involved plenty of diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But in the aftermath of their victory, the Catholic monarchs compelled the remaining Muslims, known as the Moors, as well as Sephardic Jews to either convert to Christianity or leave. Similarly, beginning in 1496, Portugal attempted to forcibly convert or expel its Jewish population. Those who converted became known as New Christians, and to police the authenticity of their faith, the Catholic Church established the Office of the Inquisition. This long history of begrudging toleration and repressive violence had a strong influence on Iberian encounters with the peoples of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Having consolidated their control over both the military and merchant classes, Iberian monarchs sought to bypass the Islamic world and gain more direct access to the goods and markets of Africa and Asia. The rulers of Portugal invested heavily and acted aggressively in securing access to trade. From his estate on the coast of southern Portugal, Infante Dom Henrique, known in English as Prince Henry the Navigator, had long coveted access to the African gold and spice supply blocked by the Moors of Morocco. In 1415, he sponsored an amphibious attack on the Moroccan port city of Ceuta, which gave Portugal a foothold on mainland North Africa and, it was hoped, a link to the trans-Saharan caravans that brought gold from the south. In the meantime, more ports were seized and a string of forts established from which to launch slave and livestock raids. The prince also sponsored developments in research and technology. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors perfected the astrolabe, a tool to calculate latitude, and the caravel, a ship well suited for exploration. Both were technological breakthroughs. Complementing the magnetic compass, which had been adopted from the Chinese, the astrolabe allowed for more precise navigation. Combining maneuverability, thanks to the triangular lateen sails invented by Arab sailors, with a deep draft for carrying larger cargoes, the caravel could handle the Atlantic's rough seas. Improving technologies went hand in hand with the dissemination of cartographic and oceanic knowledge. The Atlantic is an enormous ocean, with distinct wind patterns and currents acting as conduits for those who learned how to use them. Otherwise, voyages were largely restricted by the impossibility of a return trip. Italian and Iberian mariners eventually realized they had to sail further west, into the open ocean before catching the currents to West Africa, known to Europeans as Guinea, or using the Gulf Stream to cruise home from the coast of North America. It should be remembered that these successes built upon a series of intimidating failures. In 1291, for example, Venice's Vivaldi brothers sailed into the Atlantic in search of India and were never seen again. The archipelagos of the eastern Atlantic, including the Azores, the Madeiras, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde Islands, were Spain and Portugal's first overseas colonies. They proved to be important models for later settlements, as well as staging grounds for contacting the coasts of sub-Saharan Africa, and eventually for crossing the Atlantic. Although Roman geographers knew them as the Fortunate Isles, Europeans had lost awareness of the Canaries for centuries. Beginning in the early 15th century, Norman knights, backed by the kings of Castile and Portugal, launched invasions that relied on divide-and-rule politics to gain a foothold. New patterns of human and ecological destruction followed. Isolated from the mainlands of Europe and Africa for millennia, the native peoples of the Canary Islands, distantly related to the Berbers and known as the Guanches, were hunted as slaves, ravaged by diseases, and assimilated into Iberian society. This protracted demographic disaster presaged the one experienced by many Native American populations upon the arrival of the Spanish. Yet the successes of Guanche resistance, which relied mostly on Stone Age weapons, also hinted at the limits of European power. In 1494, a Guanche force routed a Spanish army on Tenerife, inflicting nearly 1,000 casualties, and the final campaign to conquer the islands only concluded in 1497. Amid the wars of conquest, these islands became the first in the Atlantic world where sugar was cultivated by enslaved workers on large-scale plantations. Southern European trading empires like those managed by the Genoese, Catalans, Aragonese, and Venetians entered the Levantine commerce in sugar and slaves in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Portuguese learned the sugar-growing process from Italian merchants, who acted as middlemen between them and the Muslim Mediterranean, where plantations were worked mainly by enslaved Africans and Slavic-speaking Eastern Europeans. Transplanted to the rich volcanic soils of the Madeiras and São Tomé, sugar and its byproducts became widely popular and wildly profitable. It was a difficult crop to grow, but on the Atlantic islands the Portuguese had found fertile and defensible sites to support production. From São Tomé, the technology, techniques, and brutal labor regime of the plantation system was transported to the Caribbean and Brazil. 3. North and West Africa to 1500. While Portuguese crews reconnoitered the coast of Africa, the continent's peoples, regions, and goods had long intrigued European travelers, but for the most part were known to them mainly through Muslim or Italian intermediaries such as Ibn Battuta, Alvise Cadamosto, or Leo Africanus. The Catalan Atlas, a map of the known world as understood by the Jewish cartographers who produced it around 1375, vividly illustrates the European association of West Africa with powerful rulers who controlled an immense supply of gold. Depicted on the map is Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, who wears a gilded crown while holding a scepter in one hand and a golden orb in the other. During Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, an essential duty for every devout Muslim, his spending during a layover in Egypt allegedly caused the price of gold to drop for several years. Besides gold, sub-Saharan Africa beckoned Europeans with rumors that a lost crusader had founded a Christian kingdom near what is today Ethiopia. For their part, Africa's sub-Saharan societies from Mali to Tanzania had long been in contact with the wider world through the Islamic trade networks that connected them to the Mediterranean Sea and Indian Ocean. Like the Americas, Africa was shaped by the great diversity of its political and religious systems. The continent's peoples lived in stateless band societies, small towns, and great empires, while practicing Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and thousands of animistic faiths. Like people everywhere, their identities were primarily local and mediated by extended family ties. The expansion of Islam in Africa began with the 8th century conquests that carried Arab armies from Egypt to Morocco. From there, the faith was spread across the Sahara Desert by merchants and clerics to a region Arabs called the Sahel, meaning shore, where the savanna and desert meet. Once a barrier, the Sahara became a highway to the Sahel, thanks to the camel caravans and oases that sustained them during the 2-month crossing. This region was watered by the Niger River, whose valley supported the rise of Gao and Timbuktu, the great trading cities whose market in gold, slaves, and salt drew travelers across the sands. From the 1100s to the 1500s, the Western Sahel was the core of several empires, including that of Mali and Songhai. Their rulers were mostly Muslim, and until the 19th century Islam in sub-Saharan Africa remained a mostly elite and urban religion. Many of the first converts were kings who sought otherworldly alternatives after traditional rituals failed to alleviate droughts or similar problems. Paired with a written language, Arabic, as a universal law code, Islam also appealed to Sahel kings who wished to tax, trade, and extract tribute. In converting to Islam, African kings like Mansa Musa announced their readiness to reach across the Sahara and do business with the Muslim-dominated Mediterranean. By the 1300s, Timbuktu's skyline included several mosques, and the city had become renowned as a center of Islamic learning as well as trade. Blending economic and religious motivations, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to make sustained contact with African societies when they established small bases, usually not more than a few dozen men, along the Atlantic coast during the 15th century. Portuguese trading posts called feitorias, factories, dealt in gold, slaves, and spices, and the profits funded further trade and exploration of the coast in a stop-and-start pattern. Embarking in 1497, Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope to reach East Africa and India before making the return journey 2 years later. In 1500, the Crown dispatched Pedro Alvarez Cabral to follow up on da Gama's voyage, but his ships were blown too far west and made landfall in Brazil. Falling on Portugal's side of the imaginary line created by the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the Atlantic between Spanish and Portuguese spheres, Brazil was initially a marginal colony. During the early 1500s, Portuguese and later French ships arrived to reprovision and trade with the natives for valuable dyewoods. Beginning in the 1530s, the Portuguese crown became more involved in backing colonization, and its forces succeeded in driving off the French. Small but permanent settlements were built along the coast, where merchants and soldiers began experimenting with sugar production and raiding the local indigenous peoples for slaves. Following a series of slave uprisings and droughts, most of São Tomé's merchant community migrated to Brazil, bringing with them capital, enslaved Africans, and sugar-making technology. In what became a recurring pattern, it was Portugal's policies in Congo, present-day Angola, that determined the course of Brazil's colonial history. The relationship between the kingdoms of Congo and Portugal had auspicious beginnings. In 1491, King Nzinga Nkubu was baptized and took the name João I in honor of his new ally, João II of Portugal. An embassy was sent to Lisbon, and the king's successor, Afonso I, continued to foster good relations. One Congolese prince was schooled in Rome and ordained as a bishop. Like the conversions to Islam in the Sahel, Christianization in the Congo was largely an elite practice involving the royal family, nobility, and courtiers. Most Central Africans continued to practice a variety of animistic religions, and in any case, Congolese Catholicism incorporated aspects of local traditions, such as the veneration of ancestors. Kinship also strengthened ties between the Portuguese and the Congolese. A small, overwhelmingly male population remained along the coast to trade with their African counterparts, and Portuguese merchants soon married elite women, creating a bicultural Luso-African merchant community centered at São Tomé, Cape Verde, and Luanda. Gold, ivory, and Malagueta pepper were highly sought after, but the most lucrative traffic was increasingly the trade in enslaved human beings.